The fortress of light. The war was won. The Saxons were broken. But Arthur, sitting by his campfire on the night of Badon, knew a terrifying truth. Winning a war is easy. Building a peace is hard. Britain was safe, but it was shattered. The Roman cities were graveyards. The laws were forgotten. The people had lived in fear for so long they had forgotten how to live in hope. They didn't just need a protector anymore. They needed a vision. Arthur didn't want to rule over a collection of mud huts and frightened tribes. He wanted to resurrect the glory of Rome, but better. He wanted to build a capital that would stand as a beacon against the encroaching dark. He chose a location. The legends call it Camelot. Historians argue over it. Was it Cadbury Castle? Caerleon? Winchester? It doesn't matter where it was on the map. It matters what it was in the heart. Imagine the transformation. The sound of war horns was replaced by the rhythm of the mason's hammer. Stone was quarried from the earth. Forests were felled. On a high hill, rising above the mist, a fortress began to take shape. It was a marvel of the age. White stone walls that gleamed in the sunlight. High towers flying banners of the red dragon. Inside, there were paved streets, a great hall, and a sense of order that had been missing for 100 years. For a peasant looking up from the muddy fields, seeing Camelot was like seeing a piece of heaven brought down to earth. It was proof that chaos could be tamed. But a castle is just a pile of rocks without men to defend it. And here lay Arthur's greatest political challenge. He had united the warlords of Britain to fight a common enemy. But now that the enemy was gone, the old rivalries returned. The kings of the north, the dukes of the west, they were proud men, violent men. If Arthur invited them to a feast, who would sit at the head of the table? Who would sit nearest the king? To give one lord a seat of honor was to insult the others. A feast could turn into a bloodbath before the first course was served. Arthur's solution was a stroke of genius. It was not a weapon, but a piece of furniture. The round table. Some say it was a wedding gift from Guinevere's father. Some say Merlin conjured it. But its power was in its geometry. In a circle, there is no head. There is no foot. The king sits alongside his subjects. When the warlords walked into the great hall, ready to argue over precedence, they saw the table. They understood immediately. Here, under Arthur's roof, they were equals. They were not there as rivals. They were there as brothers. This was the birth of a new kind of aristocracy, not based on lineage, but on merit. And what men they were. The fame of Camelot spread across the known world, drawing warriors like moths to a flame. They came from everywhere. They weren't just thugs in iron, they were the superheroes of the Dark Ages. First among them was Lancelot of the Lake, the French knight, handsome, brooding, and terrifyingly skilled. He was the perfect soldier, the sword that never failed. He was Arthur's right hand, his champion, and his dearest friend. Then there was Gawain, Arthur's nephew, the Sun Knight. He was the old strength of Britain, rougher, fiercer, loyal to a fault. If Lancelot was the rapier, Gawain was the hammer. There were others. Kay, the sharp-tongued steward. Bors, the steady. And later, the young, mystical Galahad, who sought spiritual perfection rather than martial glory. Arthur took these killers, men who had spent their lives slaughtering Saxons, and he gave them a purpose. He didn't ask them to stop fighting. He asked them to fight for something else. This was the revolution, the code of chivalry. Before Arthur, power was its own justification. If you had a sword and the other man didn't, you took his land. That was the law of the jungle. Arthur gathered his knights in the great hall, the firelight dancing on their armor, and he made them swear a new oath: to never commit outrage or murder, to flee from treason, to give mercy to those who ask for it, to always help ladies, damsels, and gentlewomen, to fight for the weak who could not fight for themselves. It was a radical idea. Might for right. Power was not a privilege to be exploited. It was a duty to be discharged. The sword was not a tool of oppression. It was a tool of justice. For a brief, shining moment, it worked. The Pax Arturia, the peace of Arthur, settled over the land. The roads were safe. A virgin could walk from one end of the kingdom to the other with a bag of gold and not be molested. Courts were established. Justice was dispensed. It was the golden age, the summer of the kingdom. The poets sang, the crops grew, and the people believed that this paradise would last forever. But perfection is not meant for this world. Camelot was a dream, and dreams are fragile. As the years of peace stretched on, the knights grew restless. A sword that is never drawn begins to rust. A warrior without a war begins to look for trouble. Arthur sat on his throne, watching his kingdom with pride, but perhaps he missed the shadows lengthening in the corners of the great hall. He didn't see the stolen glances between his best friend and his queen. He didn't see the resentment festering in the hearts of those who felt left out of the circle. He had built a perfect machine of government, but he had forgotten the one variable he couldn't control: the human heart. The external enemies were defeated, but the internal enemies, lust, envy, and pride, were just waking up. The walls of Camelot were high enough to keep the Saxons out, but they were not high enough to keep the darkness out, because the darkness was already inside.